In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And then there was a bunch more days, and during those days, God created everything else. That's all the plants and all the animals and all the food and all the drink and the people, and that's the important part. The people who were made in the image of God were his image bearers, and those people were super cool. They got to walk with God in the garden, and then he told them that they could eat of any tree in the garden. There was probably a whole bunch of trees and lots of fruit and lots of good stuff, and he said you can eat from any of these trees, but you can't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And that was really the only thing they had to do to stay in paradise. But then a snake came along, and the snake was yapping, and the yapping snake said, well, did he really say that if you ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil that you would die? Like, you should totally do it. And he said that to Eve, the woman who was created, and she was like, okay, say less. And she ate it, and then she gave it to her husband Adam, and he also ate it, and that was that. Then we got kicked out of the garden, and humanity was then had to suffer, and they got kicked out of paradise because they got to try paradise and they were not any good at it. And so then after being kicked out of paradise, they tried to do some life and stuff, so they had some kids, but then the kids killed each other, and so that didn't go very well for the first round there. And so then we, tried another round, and we kept trying rounds for a while, and it didn't go very well. In fact, some more of those people who may or may not have been related to that snake from earlier, these were some angels who God created to help him, just communicate with humans and stuff like that. They came and they wanted to hang out with the humans, except they did a lot more than hang out, and you could insinuate whatever you want from that. But in the long and short of it, they made some giant babies, and the giant babies were not cool with God at all. So he's like, okay, I'm going to flood the whole world because you're all so bad, and there's giant babies everywhere. And so he flooded the world. But there was one dude who was super good, and that dude's name was Noah. And so he's like, okay, because you're super good, you and your family can live. And so they flooded the world, and these people built a boat, and they survived in the boat. And they also took a bunch of animals with them. And then after they got off the boat, they were like, this is great. And then God gave them a rainbow. And that's cool because rainbows are cool. Then after the rainbow and the ark landing, then they started to make people again, and there was more people. But then the people were so good at being people that they built a giant tower to go up to the heavens and say to God, look at us, we're amazing. We built a giant tower. Now we don't need you anymore because we can just look from any direction of any part of the world and we can see our giant tower and we'll know how amazing we are. And God's like, that's really funny. Here's languages. And so he gave them a bunch of different languages so they could no longer talk to each other. And then he also spanked them hard enough that they flew across to the different corners of the world and were all separated all of a sudden. And he probably did that with the animals too, and that would explain evolution, by the way, but that's a whole different story. So then after that, everybody gets separated and stuff, and God's like, well, screw all these people because there's just so many of them and they're all so bad. So what if I just pick one and try to do my thing with them? And that's what he did. And so he picked Abraham, and Abraham was a relatively cool guy, except that he stayed in his mom's tent until he was 100 years old. And God was like, bro, get out of your mom's tent and go conquer something. And he was like, okay, but why should I do that? And God's like, well, if you do it, I'll give you the biggest family ever. And so Abraham was like, okay, bet. And he left his tent and he went out, and he took his nephew Lot with him, and they went and they settled in a foreign land to go and do some cool conquering and stuff. But then Lot went and lived in this awful city where everybody was trying to have sex with each other all the time, and then everybody was trying to have sex with angels, and the angels were like, no, bro, God sent us here to judge you, and they're like, still, we don't care. And then the angels are like, okay, well, now God's going to destroy this place. And so Abraham had to get Lot out of there, and so they got out of there, but Lot's wife looked back, and she turned into salt, by the way. That's just an off-rip thing that happened, and we're not going to talk about that anymore from now on. But then anyhow, eventually Abraham and Lot, just move on with their lives, and eventually Abraham has a kid, and his kid's name is Isaac, and God's like, hey, kill Isaac. And Abraham's like, what the heck? No, I don't want to kill Isaac. But God's like, yeah, you got to kill Isaac. And then Abraham was like, oh my gosh, I thought this God was different than all the other gods that made you sacrifice children, but I guess I'll do it because I don't want to be disobedient to God because I trust him and he's done so much stuff for me. So he goes and he sacrifices Isaac, except that he doesn't because God interrupts him and it's like, wait, no, bro, here's a ram. Sacrifice that ram instead. I was just testing you to see if you had the faith to do what I asked of you. And Abraham was like, yeah, I had the faith. And actually in Hebrews, it tells us that he had so much faith that he believed that God would either stop him from killing him or bring him back to life. And he was right. So that's awesome. But then we have Isaac. And eventually Isaac gets a wife, and his wife's name is Rebecca. And then Abraham dies, and then Isaac and Rebecca have two kids, and their kids are named Jacob and Esau. And Jacob comes out of the womb holding Esau's heel. So technically Esau's the firstborn, but Jacob is like a total heel holder. And you can see that later when he totally steals his birthright from Esau. So technically, because Esau is the firstborn, because he just came out of the womb first, he has that birthright. But then Esau tricks him and steals it from him to get him to eat some soup. And he totally does that. And Esau's like, I'm going to kill you. And Jacob's like, no, could you not do that? So he runs away. After running away, he eventually decides to come back, and they're going to like make up and be cool with each other, or they're possibly going to like fight each other. But any hoozle doozle, in the midst of that, God shows up, and he's just like there, and he just like fights Jacob, and then he renames Jacob to Israel after he taps him and his socket falls out of place, and he's like, dude, you totally wrestled with God, and that's what Israel means. And then we go on from there, and they sort of make up, but it's sort of not talked about after that. The important thing is that Jacob, who's now called Israel, is going to be the real father of nations that we were talking about all the way back at Abraham. So he totally has 12 kids, which is crazy, bro. And the important ones are all of them, but also mostly Joseph. And that's because Joseph's awesome, probably because he's the first son of the wife that he loved the most, which that's a complicated thing, but we're not going to have time for that in this video. So long story short, Joseph is the cool kid, and so he gets him like this really dope jacket, and it's got rainbow colors on it. As we've already established in this video, rainbows are awesome, and God likes them, and Jacob likes them too, so he gives it to Joseph, and then Joseph likes rainbows as well. And so then we have rainbow son, and he has a cool rainbow coat, and his brothers are like, bro, what are you doing with that rainbow coat? And they get super mad about how their father likes him more than them, and so they're like, okay, let's get rid of him. And so they go to get rid of him, and they shove him in a hole, and they take his coat and they put blood on it, and then they go back and they're like, dude, he totally died. And by the way, while he was in the hole, then some slavers came by and they get him out of the hole and they sell him to the slavers, and then he gets taken to Egypt. And either way, they have no idea what happened to him, but they go back to Jacob and they say, bro, Joseph died, and Jacob's super upset, and then they're like, oh crap. And then like 100 years go by, not really, but like a couple. And it turns out that Joseph is super awesome at reading dreams. And so basically everybody in Egypt is having bad dreams. And then Joseph's like, hey, here's what your dreams mean, because God blessed me at reading dreams. And then he rises to the top of power and becomes second in command to the Pharaoh of Egypt. And so that's really cool. And then there's a big famine where nobody has any food. And so all of Joseph's brothers have to travel to Egypt to get food. And they go to Egypt, and it turns out Joseph is there, but they don't recognize him because it's been like 100 years or whatever. And then Joseph's like, bro, you came here for some food? I think you're spies. I'm going to kill you. And they're like, no. And then they're like, why are you torturing us? And then they keep the youngest brother, and then they have to go back to Jacob and say, they kept the youngest brother. We got to bring you back, and we all got to come here. But then they all come back, and he's like, no, it's me, Joseph, and I just wanted to prank you because you left me in a hole and then you sold me to slavers. And they're like, dude, that's totally cool. And then they all cry and make up, and now the family lives in Egypt, and that is super cool. I don't think that anything could possibly go wrong from them living in Egypt now, because like the Pharaoh likes them and stuff. So yeah, they're totally in with the Pharaoh, and Israel lives in Egypt, and probably happily ever after. If you enjoyed this video and you're interested in a part 2, please consider subscribing to Credence Questions. I got lots of other content on the channel, lots of other content on the way, and if this is a series that you had a little bit of fun with, then I hope that you would consider subscribing and following along so that we can continue the series in a little bit of a humorous manner.